There's the widening wealth gap between the rich and the poor. The report said the ongoing pandemic creates a new billionaire every 30 hours, and at the same rate, 1 million people could fall into extreme poverty. It also found that billionaires in the food and energy sectors get $1 billion richer every 2 days. Now, what can be done to plug that wealth gap? We have with us John Samuel, Oxfam Asia's Regional Director. John, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, John, with billionaires amassing wealth, plunging millions into poverty, we really see that the system is flawed. But it differs actually from country to country, of course, in how we deal with the pandemic. But, pharmaceutical companies is actually a global organization. So what do you think is the best way to remedy this?
I think the most important problem we need to realize is inequality kills people every day. Inequality kills one person every 4 seconds in the world. And during the last 2 years, 20 million people lost lives due to pandemic. At the same time, there are billionaires in the energy sector, there are new billionaires, 40 billionaires in the pharmaceutical sector. And this inequality is unprecedented in our lifetime and the recent history of the world. And inequality not only kills, it discriminates people. And the richer become richer and the poor people become poorer. And while 99% of the people lost out, 1% of the rich made huge amount of profit in the pharma sector, in the agri sector, and also in the energy sector. What needs to be done? Number one, in the history of the world, there are a number of examples for what you call emergency tax. The pandemic has created a new situation, unprecedented in the history of the world, but also it increased inequality everywhere. Gender inequality, income inequality, and even environmental inequality. So what is the real reason? Tax injustice. The rich pay much less tax than the poor people in the world. So hence, our suggestion is to ensure that there is a pandemic emergency tax to the richest people in the world and in the countries, corporates. And it's also their moral, political, and social responsibility to do that. The second thing is, if you really tax the richest billionaires in the world, annually, a wealth tax just increasing 2 to 5%, we'll be getting around $2.52 trillion every year. And that's enough to address the poverty in the world. And it will take 2.3 billion people out of poverty, lack of medicine, lack of vaccination, everything. And the third is ensure there's more progressive tax. If you look at everywhere in the world, most of the taxes are indirect taxes. It actually, as a proportion, tax poor more than the rich. So it's important to get back to progressive tax. And the reason is, not only there is the neoliberal policies globally benefited the global giants in food sector, pharmaceutical sector, and energy sector. But in our own countries, in the global south, there is a new phenomenon of crony capitalism. So that there few of the rich companies which are closer to the government makes billion. So billionaires has increased, but billions of people have been pushed to poverty, and that's the reality. And if we don't address this injustice, there'll be more troubles. What we have seen in Sri Lanka recently is an indicator. And inflation is growing in most of the countries, both in the global south and global north. So this needs to be addressed as early as possible. That's our perspective on this, because poverty is injustice, and this injustice is also due to tax injustice. And climate injustice increase further poverty in the world. So poor become poorer and the rich become richer, and this is not acceptable.
That's actually the harsh things in life. What you mentioned earlier, that the poor gets poorer and the richer just becomes richer. But you mentioned earlier also of calls to tax the rich. Is there ever a country in the world that has been able to do so? And was it actually, was it actually good? Did it actually do good for their economy?
If you really look at the post-Second World War economy, for example, what France has done and many countries have did, there was a huge redistribution initiative. There's something called Beveridge Report in the UK, and it was happened during the height of those inequality and poverty, and it was a redistribution policy. Look at a few years in India where I live, there was right to work. It was a huge redistribution system. It's one of the largest, it's around more than $10 billion are being used to actually ensure there is work for the poor 100 days in a year. So there are lots of redistributive policies happened across the world when there was too much inequality. And these redistributive policies, both the social protections, our one-time cash transfer, etc., not only help to build the economy, increase the economic growth, but also it ensures poor people get cash in their hand, more resources in their hand, so that the economic aggregate demands increases. So there should be a number of policies. Tax is one of those policies, but more than that, there are a number of other strategies used. For example, in India, there was something called professional tax and wealth cess, which actually generated huge amount of money for this redistributive system called right to work. It is called National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. There are such policies which have been introduced in many parts of the world. So it is possible. And there are a number of examples in the history of the world during Second World War, after the Second World War, and even recently, those who have been marginalized because of the neoliberal policies in the global south.
Okay, thank you for that, John. But actually, when we when we lump the billionaires together, they don't even make a huge percentage of the total world population. But the amount that they're earning is actually more than what the poorer nations need. So my question is, how do we redistribute the wealth now, rather? Can we tap international movements to give assistance to poorer nations?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways. Globally speaking, the rich countries, should help through the progressive tax to write off the debt of many of the poor countries, because the debt of the poor countries make the people poorer. There was actually, Philippines is a classic example, Jubilee 1000, Jubilee movement was to write off the debt. And the leadership actually came from Philippines. So it's very important to ensure the debt relief and debt cancellation. That's one thing. Number two, there should be a global wealth tax which can be redistributed to the least developed countries, the poorest countries with the resources, etc. And number three, if you look at climate issues in terms of carbon footprinting, the total carbon footprinting is still by the richest countries. And there's no technology transfer, there's no adaptation. So this also is very important in terms of transfer of technology, transfer of resources. So this has to be a global movement. And there is a global movement for tax justice. And this needs to be done because many of the global billionaires move their wealth to non-taxable countries and tax havens. So this also needs to be addressed. So we need to have a global movement for this tax justice, but at the same time we need to ask hard questions to our own government to be accountable to the people. Now government will have to take a stand whether they are with the rich billionaires or the poor people, 90% of the poor people in global south. In Asia, particularly, it's evident in Philippines, in India, in Indonesia, all over the world. The people have become poorer because of pandemic, less purchasing capacity, and it has affected the economy. and the inflation, food inflation is increasing everywhere. In Sri Lanka, it was so dramatic. You have seen it. And still people don't have food, fuel, everything.
Yeah.
But this is happening everywhere. So we need to be careful. The government will have to be accountable to the people and to ensure they are with the poor and the marginalized, women, and rather than siding with the richest of the people in our own country.
Yes.
So it is global and national policy changes are required.
It is actually a really huge wall that we have to tear down. John Samuel, thank you so much for your time. Oxfam Asia's Regional Director, sir, thank you. It's been an honor and enlightening talking to you.
Thank you very much.